So what could be a better return on investment, Rob? What could we invest our resources in if we're not going to tackle hesitancy? If hesitancy is not to blame, how are we going to deal with this in the future? Well, I would argue that now is the time when we need a shift in perspective. Immunization is a best buy. 14 of 17 SDGs are addressed through immunization. And when we talk about universal health coverage, we talk about primary health care, we talk about health security. Without immunization, there's none of that. So I feel that now we're at a point where we could suggest a more challenging, or challenge ourselves, maybe, to make an investment that is slightly different. We know that there's a strong economic return on investments. This is for Africa. I couldn't find data on Europe, but it's likely that the ECDC and WHO may well have this data. But I just picked this up from Africa and found it astonishing, this investment case that has been made from the African continent. The point I'm trying to make is that we really have a very strong and compelling argument to look at how we invest in tackling confidence and acceptance and promote demand for vaccines today. So with my last 3-4 slides, I'm going to quickly focus on this resilience factor. So I think we could challenge ourselves to have a mission of building resilience. And I'm talking about resilience in the community, and I'm talking about resilience on our programs. So when I talk about resilience, I'm talking about the amount of change a system or community can undergo and still retain its essentially the same structure, the degree to which a system or community is capable of self-organization, and then thirdly, the degree to which a system or community expresses capacity for learning and adaptation. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that, but ultimately, if I'm arguing that if a community displays resilience, and we can promote resilience in communities, we are less likely when a little ripple of concern comes around our vaccination programs that it doesn't turn into a tidal wave, that actually the community itself is resilient to that murmur. We know that behavior is contagious. I've talked about this before. I've touched upon it already a little bit now. We know that in these cases that are shown on the board here, in terms of on the screen in front of us, that in the case of countries affected by anti-vaccine movements, we see great impact. The two countries that I want to talk about as well here are Denmark and Ireland. In Denmark, a few years ago, HPV coverage fell off a cliff. And it fell off a cliff because of adverse events related to this vaccine, related to anxiety-related events in Denmark, promotion by two particular media outlets, and a series of media productions, both in terms of print and in terms of a documentary that was produced. In Ireland, we saw a similar thing happen about the same time. Not the same severity of drop, but in Denmark's case, because Denmark dropped from being the highest, one if not the highest coverage of HPV in the world to 90 to 16% in 18-20 months. That's a severe crisis, right? Ireland didn't see quite the same dip, but it did see a considerable dive due to the same concerns in its HPV coverage. The interesting thing here is, and I thought I'd deliver these slides given where we're stood, or I'm stood, where you're sat today, because the other Scandi countries, that was a bit... Scandinavian countries, the other Scandinavian countries did not see the same impact. In fact, given the fact that you've only got a 5-kilometer stretch of water between Denmark and Sweden, it's quite remarkable how little that situation impacted these neighboring member states. So I think this warrants somebody to really deep dive into what makes these programs, I would argue, resilient to that concern. There's not enough studies on this being done at the moment. You could look at Sweden and narcolepsy as another example, how this didn't affect your other childhood vaccination or your childhood vaccination program, and how MMR actually in this country, and MMR links to autism, unlike other countries in the whole of Northern Europe, we did see a decline in Sweden, but not a phenomenal dip, and a fairly quick elastic response back to very high coverage of MMR in the region. You could argue the same for Canada today. We've got explosive outbreaks of measles in the US, across the border for Canada. We don't, in the US, we don't have the same in Canada. And Canada, much the same in terms of both the autism concerns, but also most recently in terms of the measles outbreaks in the US. And I would argue that someone, again, needs to look at what makes that program and community resilient to those concerns. So I'm not going to focus I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to focus on these next slides, but to say maybe we do need a slight shift to start not firefighting, but building in a future community of caregivers and a future community of providers. This is a horrible slide. This is probably the most horrible slide I have ever presented. But I tried to dump a whole load of stuff on this slide that I thought, well, we actually have evidence that these factors build resilience, as I previously defined on a slide a few moments ago. The one I wanted to focus on particularly is the last one, and these are my last two slides. The one I wanted to focus on particularly was schools. We're simply not using schools well enough around vaccination. And by this, I mean, that's the future parent. That's the parent of tomorrow. My kids leave school, they know about waste management, sexual reproductive health, they know about nutrition, diet, road safety, alcohol abuse, substance abuse. I talk to them about vaccines, and I use my younger one's phrase, that's uber cool. They think it's so cool when I start talking to them about how vaccines work. And of course, I have to put that over very simply because I'm a social scientist and I don't really understand how vaccines work. But I make this very simple and compelling argument for vaccines that they think is really exciting. We're not developing enough assignments and classroom education. We're not leveraging what we preach about all the time, this multi-sectoral support for vaccination. I mean, this would be the obvious entry point if you were to ask me. So I think there's more needed to be done here. The references I've got at the bottom here are fairly compelling. I went through each of those papers from smoking to alcohol. It's very compelling evidence. There's very compelling evidence that this makes a real impact in terms of recall of messages from 10 to 12-year-olds, but also impacts behavior if you look at longer term. So my concluding remarks before I hand over to the rock star are, this is complex, folks. This is not a question of a one-size-fits-all, oh, well, it's confidence in this factor. It's to do with trust. It's the anti-vaccine lobby's fault. They're too small a group. They affect others, but they are a very small group. The hesitants, the fence-sitters, they are our concern. We don't get into the sandpit and start throwing sand back at the anti-vaxxers. They'll never change. They'll always be there. Live with it. Work with the people who they influence. And I suggest to you and recommend to you today, and I realize a lot of future leaders are sat in this room today, so I would really compel you to think about a longer-term investment so that in the future, when we have these a crisis does not emerge from a little concern or a minor blip in our programs, or a new paper or a rumor doesn't result in a tidal wave. Become not firefighters, but start building the house of inflammable or non-flammable material so that it doesn't go up in flames when there's a small concern. Because I would argue that's almost a better return on investment. Now, I've tried to make a quite compelling argument for why we should have a longer-term return on investment. That's not to say that we shouldn't continue what we're doing, because there is some new science around vaccine hesitancy, which is really exciting. And I'm so happy to be stood up here and sat next to Wolfgang, because I know what's coming. So I'll leave it there, and I'll thank you for your attention. The reception's coming soon. Don't worry, just stick with it. We're almost there. Thanks.